Gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to a debate entitled Multiculturalism and Multilingualism in a Society. The debate takes place as a part of the Second International Congress, Humanities, Society and Identity, hosted by the Faculty of Modern Languages, University of Warsaw. And I would like to thank the organizers, Dean Robert Małecki and the team for inviting and gathering such a wonderful group of scientists for today's debate. My name is Jarosław Włodarczyk. I'm a journalist, and I have an honor and privilege to host our meeting tonight. Probably for most of you, there is no need to introduce our guests, but for the rest of you who need it, let me introduce the debaters alphabetically. The first is a Hungarian poet, literary critic, editor, and literary historian from Babeș-Bolyai University in Romania, Professor Imre József Balázs. Big applause. A second person I would like to present you is a historian of ideas and identities, as well of the history of minorities and minority languages, politics from University of Oulu from Finland, Professor Ainur Elmgren. Now the director of the School of the Study of Canada, Professor of Geography in the School of the Environment at Trent University, Professor Nicol. And probably most known for most of the public tonight, Professor of French Literature and Culture at the University of Lausanne, and also outstanding translator of Polish literature, Professor François Rosset. Thank you for being tonight in Warsaw. A lot of snow in Finland, but also in Switzerland, and it was not easy flight and to get to Warsaw. We've got delays all over Europe. I would like to start our conversation with a very general question. And please refer your answers to it from the perspective of your countries, of explaining what languages, local migrant languages you deal with in your country. And the first question is, do multilingualism and multiculturalism influence political pluralism and social tolerance? And if so, in what way? Maybe we will start from our left to right and from your right to left.
Thank you very much for the amazing introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. I'm deeply honored and also somewhat intimidated because I realized that I'm probably in a panel of famous people that I, as a historian, are only now getting to know to the full extent of their expertise and their experience. So also a word of warning that as a historian my answers will probably be a bit long and meandering and not always to the point, so I will try to be brief. And the question was already very challenging, I must say, because already from the perspective of our countries doesn't exactly narrow it down for me, but rather makes the question into a whole thesis or several theses, since I see both Finland and Sweden as my countries, both legally and from the point of view of my work life experience and my personal life experience. So I will try to solve the issue of answering this question by not trying to cover everything in it, but by giving some examples, perhaps partly based on personal experience, partly on the actual historical experiences and the laws that govern issues of minority languages and the relations between majority and minority in these countries. So I will not try to list all the minority languages that we have officially recognized in these countries on various levels, which is a big issue, but I will try to give an overview of how these matters are regulated in Sweden and in Finland through some examples. So, as I mentioned, both Sweden and Finland. I grew up in Sweden. I was born in the late 70s in Sweden as the child of Finnish immigrants. And back then, there had been introduced a law, a home language reform, which gave the right to immigrants speaking specific home languages, for example, Finnish, to get teaching in their languages in the Swedish school system. So multilingual pupils who wanted mother tongue teaching, native language teaching and study guidance in their mother tongue could receive it if a suitable teacher was available, which was not always the case. But when I went to school in Sweden in the 80s, this meant that there was the possibility to attend preschool teaching in Finnish in a completely Finnish-speaking class. There was the possibility of attending primary school in a completely Finnish-speaking class up to at least grade 6. At least in my hometown, this was completely provided for. However, what is the difference to today? Today, Finnish is recognized as a minority language, as a national minority language. So the Finnish speakers in Sweden are recognized as a national minority, which means that they are no longer seen as an immigrant group, but a minority which is recognized as historically a part of Swedish history, going way hundreds of years back when Finland was a part of the Swedish kingdom. And there are several of these national minorities which have been recognized since 2010. The Jews, the Roma people, the Sami, who are also an indigenous people, the Swedish Finns, as I said, and the Tornedal people, which speak a language related to Finnish. So they, according to this new recognition, Sweden has certain obligations to protect the rights of these minorities as national minorities. Which means that from being seen as migrants, which were protected, had certain linguistic rights protected back from the mid-70s onward, the Finnish speakers in Sweden are now seen as a national minority and their rights are protected under that umbrella term. But looking at what the experiences in practice are from my fellow Finnish speakers in Sweden today who try to educate their children in Finnish under the protection of this 2010 law, the experience is that they have to struggle. That it is difficult to get these rights which they have been guaranteed since 2010 as historically recognized national minorities. So there is a paradox. How come that back in the 80s when we were only immigrants, we had much larger visible presence in the public? Our language was on national television, our language was on the radio, our language was spoken in schools in parallel to Swedish language. And what sometimes could be experienced in our hometown was these little comments in the style of, during the lunch break, a teacher would tell me not to speak Finnish to the kids in the Finnish class because the Swedish-speaking kids would feel left out and it would make them feel sad. So this was the level of oppression at the time. However, it left me the feeling that, wow, I have a superpower. I have to be careful with this so I can use my powers wisely. This is a kind of different experience from what the revitalization activists today have. So what has happened in between? What happened in between was, I'm not going into the details of the Swedish school reforms in the early 90s and so on, but I'm just going to say one word: assimilation. So that is perhaps my hypothesis of what has happened. According to numbers from the Sweden-Finnish activist organizations that exist since the 70s and 80s, there should be about 700,000 people in Sweden who have some sort of Finnish origin and who could be eligible to get, their children and grandchildren could be eligible to get this kind of education in the Finnish language. You don't have to speak it at home anymore to have the right to get Finnish teaching at school, a support for your language. But there are very few who apply for this support. So there is a problem, and then the schools and authorities can say that there is no demand. So we don't have the capacity to offer this kind of support because there is no demand. Well, that's a problem in Sweden today. Maybe I have said enough about Sweden. I will leave my anecdotes about Finland to the next question, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Elmgren. Professor Rosset, what's your experience from Swiss perspective of multilingualism and the tolerance and social acceptance of multi-languages?
Yes, thank you. Yes, okay. Well, German-speaking Swiss used to say that Switzerland is ein Sonderfall. And actually, Switzerland is a special case, especially in the question of multilingualism. Multilingualism is there in Switzerland indigenous. It has been present since the 15th century. It is enshrined in the federal constitution, which designates 4 languages as national languages. German for 62% of the country, French for 23%, Italian 8%, and Romansh, in Polish Retoromański, 0.5%. Romansh is a bit of a special case, since it is a language spoken in 5 different variations by only 60,000 people. Like a linguistic monument dating back to the 13th century and preserved in conservation strategies, similarly to a museum object. None of the other 3 national languages is really Swiss. The people who speak them are on cultural peripheries related to centers which are elsewhere in Germany, in France, in Italy. This means, and this is really very important, that language is not a criterion of national identity. From a linguistic point of view, Swiss cultural productions represent minority productions in a context of a broader linguistic area. It means French, German, Italian. In this country, language cannot be used to define the notion of national culture. It should also be pointed out that German speakers in Switzerland don't really speak German, but regional dialects that are slightly different from each other and clearly different from standard German, Hochdeutsch. These dialects, similarly to Romansh, could be defined as specifically Swiss languages, but they are mainly oral linguistic forms. In fact, German-speaking Swiss don't call standard German Hochdeutsch, but Schriftdeutsch, meaning written German. In the 20th century, immigration also became an important issue. 25% of the resident population are not of Swiss nationality. As a result, Romansh, the only language that can truly be described as Swiss, is spoken by far fewer people than English, Portuguese, Serbo-Croatian, Albanian, Spanish, Turkish, or even now Ukrainian. 22% of the population speak a language other than the 4 national languages at home. We could go on for hours about this very complex linguistic situation, but I will just say this in answer to your question. It is the plurality of languages, like the plurality of geographical and economic conditions, the plurality of local traditions, the plurality of religions, and therefore the plurality itself as a basic condition of communities that best characterizes the Swiss national culture. Living in Switzerland has always meant living with others, or at least living alongside others. It means accepting diversity. In fact, I prefer to talk about acceptance rather than tolerance, the latter having an embarrassing moral resonance. It is a fact that plurality determines all social, political, and cultural life in this country.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Balázs, so let's talk about this acceptance, not necessarily social tolerance. You live in 2 languages, Romanian and Hungarian, and what are your experience in this field of acceptance or tolerance?
Yes, I come from a city, Cluj, Kolozsvár, that when tourists come to visit, they ask us, we noticed that you are very religious people here in Cluj. And when I look at them, why do you think so? They tell me that, well, there are so many churches in the city center in Cluj. You must be very religious people here. And yes, if I try to count the churches in downtown Cluj-Napoca, then there is the Roman Catholic Church in the center. There is that Reformed Church, Calvinist Church. There is that Unitarian Church. There is the Lutheran Church. There is the Orthodox Church, the Greek Catholic Church, and of course there are also synagogues in the city center. So the fact is that the multitude of these churches does not mean that we are all quite religious people. It means that we are living in a space that is traditionally quite diverse, and I believe in many ways religious diversity here in Central Europe is a model for this multiculturalism and multilingualism. We tend not to think about that many times. We live in secular societies, many of us, but I believe that our models dealing with these problems go back to this issue. To say a few words about exact data about our country, the country that I come from, Romania. Romania defines itself as a nation state. In the Romanian constitution, it says Romania is a nation state, which is quite unusual if you are a minority person like myself to think about your place in such a situation. Of course, the numbers go like this. Romania has, according to the current census, 19 million people, the totality of the inhabitants, out of which more than 1 million, a little bit above 1 million are Hungarians. And there are also Roma people, about 500,000 declared themselves Roma. It is a shady situation whether there are more or the data, the exact data says that there are 500,000 of them. There are Ukrainians, Germans, Turkish people, according to the census. The smaller region that I come from, it's the Transylvanian part. The Transylvanian part of Romania was that part that was part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the most Central European in this sense. And I believe another model in these countries that now we are present here to deal with this multicultural situation, Central European model may be another model besides the religious one that we can rely on when we discuss these situations. So it means that that this dealing with diversity has a long history in these countries, and I believe it matters because when thinking about diversity as a result of migration, for example, we tend to think differently if we see this diversity in let's say 500 years tradition. Also, the case of Switzerland is quite similar in this sense that it has a long tradition. So I believe that the issue of multiculturalism, seen from the US, seen from Canada, maybe might be different as a model that we think through these issues.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. Now let's move to Canada. And Professor Nicol, you probably have more remarks on the original languages and minorities, Canadian minorities, as well as huge number of citizens with roots outside of Canada, and also double language as a country.
Yeah, thank you. And before, can you hear me? Yeah, yeah. Okay. Before I start, just thank you very much. Is it on?
Should be red.
Hmm? It's red. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, before I start, thank you very much for having me here. It's a beautiful city, and it's been a wonderful day, and I really appreciate it. And thank you for the segue into Kent. That was wonderful. I was just listening to the conversation so far. It's interesting to see these different perspectives. You know, from the superpower to the assimilated, and then yet the two. You know, François and Imre, your experience is more of a deep and long history of either diversity in language or diversity in culture, which, you know, translates into sort of a pluralist and multicultural model. I think in Canada, yes, it is a little different. I would argue that we're quite new to this multicultural business, even though that may kind of contradict what people think. And I when I say we're new to it, perhaps I don't mean that there has not been a diversity of language spoken in Canada for centuries, but in fact the recognition and development of a multicultural society, and I do believe we are, although people will debate that does come from in many ways from linguistic diversity. And most people think of Canada perhaps as two languages, French and English, and think of Canada as a bilingual country. And I'd argue, too, that if you read folks like John Ralston Saul talks about the three pillars of the Canadian nation. And I think what's happening more recently, and I'll maybe sort of get to this in a second, is that the inclusion of Indigenous languages. It's, again, it's a little bit of a can of worms. We'll figure that one out in a minute. But we are, in fact, moving from a notion of a bilingual to a multilingual country. And it's been, I think, the experience, and I'm just sort of run you through it, really talks to how that's translated, the lingual pieces have translated into the cultural pieces. If you think about it, you know, in the in the 1700s, 1800s, language was sort of a question of dominance and hegemony. Whoever was in control got to control the language, and that meant that in Quebec it could often be English elite, depending on where you live, certainly in urban Montreal and places like that. So the Quebec language was really restricted to certain uses, certain areas, and by the time you get the 20th century, it's not the language of business, and that, of course, as many people in this audience know, triggered certain events. But one of the things that sort of came out of this recognition of, I think, the tensions of the two languages was, of course, the Official Languages Act in 1969, which recognized bilingualism. I remember that as a little girl, wondering what bilingualism was. You know, is it a disease or is it something good? They seem to like it. And having it explained to me, and I thought it was great. What I didn't know, you know, being a little girl in Toronto and not having seen much of the world, is I didn't know that excluded a whole lot of people that weren't bilingual, or at least might have some competency in either language, but really didn't call that their mother tongue and really didn't identify with it culturally. And I wasn't, you know, although I didn't recognize that, a lot of other folks did. And by 1970, in response to that sort of bilingual, or the Official Languages Act, there was the Multicultural Act. There was a recognition, there was a pushback that, wait a minute, we might have to speak French or English officially, but you know, we are a multitude of different ethnicities and nationalities, many people arriving after World War II, and that act didn't capture it. So the Multicultural Act, you know, in the 1970s addressed that. But here's what I think is really significant in the Canadian experience: that in fact, when you get that far, you get another group going, well, hold on a minute. We're not ethnicities, we are founding nations, and that would be a whole roster of Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples in Canada who objected to the idea of being called ethnic, and who objected to the idea of their languages being sidelined. And it was a long journey. You can talk, you know, there's a whole bunch of reports and papers, the White a white paper that wanted to do away with what we can talk later about details, Indian Act, and then the Hawthorne report, which pushed back and said, no, Indigenous people are part of this, new architecture of Canada, and we have to make room. And that was incredibly important and led to a number of different certain pieces of legislation came along after that, the 1982 Charter of Rights, that embedded both ethnic and embedded individual, I guess, rights and freedoms, and then Section 35 of the Constitution a little bit later in the 1980s that actually embedded Indigenous rights, within law, within the recognition of law, within the Constitution, within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. So that's huge, and all of this is triggered, I guess, in the beginning by the Official Languages Act. But what you're starting to see is this opening up of who is actually an official Canadian, and it includes newcomers, it includes what we call settlers in Canada, and it includes Indigenous peoples. But that wasn't the end, and I think that Indigenous language is the new frontier and is pushing us again towards a new understanding of multiculturalism. And it's not easy. There's a lot of tension, but we're moving. For example, you had after the Charter of Rights and the Amendment of Constitutions, or Section 35 in the Constitution, you then had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which gave Indigenous peoples a voice, I would argue, for the first time in government documents, and they began to talk about marginalization, they began to talk about these issues. You have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you have the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. Not all of them address language, but all of them address Indigenous experiences, and the recognition that comes out of that, that in fact Indigenous people belong and that their language belongs in Canada. So you've got two sort of, I would say, important other things that we sort of put on top of that. So at the same time, it's not all roses or whatever. First of all, in Quebec, of course, you have the passage of the, I forget the name, but the provincial act that the Bill 101 that limits the official language of Quebec to French, and that is another debate that sets back perhaps provincially. We can talk about more, and I think I do of that later. And at the same time, you've got Indigenous groups saying, wait a minute, whose language? And so one of the tensions, I guess the two tensions, although I'd argue we're moving towards, very well towards a multilingual and I think a plurality, I think that follows. But Indigenous groups, I think the big challenges are just saying whose language? And there's a sense that certain groups, and Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, and I'd say Inuit too, have their kind of languages, for whatever reason, are becoming dominant sort of hegemonic languages. And other groups that are equally important and lengthy, Métis, for example, Michif, have language capacities and language needs and are feeling a little bit pinched. So I think the new landscape is going to be navigating those over 116 Indigenous languages and how we incorporate something that complex into our multicultural society.
Thank you very much, and I would like to continue what you started and move from the political level to social level, to level of social groups using different languages. And I would like to ask how the clash of languages affect the relations between particular social groups. And let's start the same order, if you don't mind.
Thank you again for a very complex question. It's difficult for me to separate social life from political life, especially on a day like this. Probably many in the audience know what day it is today. It is the Independence Day of the Republic of Finland. So independent Finland turns 106 years old. I hope I got it right. My countrymen and women will be watching the president shaking hands with celebrities and war veterans, so I can get away with anything right now. And that's also why I find it difficult to talk about social relations without talking about legal relations. So talking about the clash of languages reminds me of the conflict between Finnish and Swedish, especially culminating in the regular street fights in the 1930s. But on the other hand, this conflict was limited to the educated classes in society, which has caused it to have a very big role in the way we Finns in general and also historians in particular look back at that time and deal with the question of how the language issue was solved in the country. And one way it was continuously solved was by through constitutional means, through legal means of regulating where and how these languages are used, what is their relationship to each other. And this brings me also to the question, when we are talking about minority languages and multiculturalism, are we talking about minorities and multiculturalism de facto or de jure? So is it something which we have set in law that there are specific groups with specific rights, or is it something that we see in our society that yes, this exists as a fact? So to bring back to these anecdotes that I'm telling about my countries, the Constitution of the Republic of Finland in Chapter 2, Paragraph 17, states that it is a civil right to have right to one's own language and culture. And the national languages of Finland are Finnish and Swedish. So Swedish is not a minority language de jure in Finland. De facto it is, because Swedish speakers are numerically in the minority. According to the Constitution, the right of these speakers, the speakers of these languages, is guaranteed in court and other official proceedings to use this language, to receive official documents. It's guaranteed by law. And about other minorities, other groups, which are then by law actually defined as minorities, is it's not so clear, because there are some groups that are specified, mentioned by name. For example, the indigenous Sami people are mentioned by name in the Finnish constitution. So, and then as well as Roma and other groups. So it's kind of left open who is included in these actual minorities who have the right to maintain and develop their own language and culture. The right of the Sami people to use the language in public administration is regulated by law. Then it's mentioned that sign language users also have rights, and those who need interpretation and translation due to disability, they also have legal guarantees. But for the other groups, it's left open. They have the right to maintain their culture. And it is perhaps inevitable that this constitutional definition also influences how the existence of these languages in actual public life, in actual social relations, is seen. However, it doesn't mean that Swedish language does not, in some ways, have a precarious position in Finland today. It is constantly questioned politically, and this means that it is also questioned socially on the everyday level. I personally have not experienced that anyone has come up to me when I have spoken Swedish in the streets in Finland and told me to speak Finnish. We are in Finland. This has not happened to me in the last 13 years I've spent in the country, frequently speaking Swedish in public. But I know from others who have spent their entire lives in the country that this might happen. So it is kind of a question to me also that how far can a constitutional guarantee for a language, a linguistic group's rights actually influence social perceptions? Not to mention that those groups who are seen as complete newcomers might be, their existence might be completely questioned by others, that these languages don't belong in our country because there is no history, there is no law, there is no constitutional foundation for their existence here. Perhaps that's enough for this question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's interesting, and how it looks from the perspective of social groups. We cannot even say social groups when we talk about original Cantonese languages, but how do you feel that clash of languages affect social groups' life in Switzerland?
Well, of course, the cohabitation of different linguistic communities in Switzerland is not without its difficulties. The percentages I gave earlier show that there is a clear majority of German speakers. As a result, we often observe typical relations of domination that generate certain tensions. It's obviously a question of power. In Switzerland, the societal and political apparatus relies on coexistence of minorities, negotiation, and making concessions to reach a consensus. This is undoubtedly the most striking feature of Switzerland's political and social reality. Nonetheless, the Latin minorities often have the painful impression of being dominated by the Germans. This can often be seen in the exercise of direct democracy. It means in the many referenda where the people vote on all sorts of issues, 4 or 5 times a year. Often, it is the voice of the German-speaking majority that dictates the outcome, while the majority of Latins vote the other way. But it should be added that it is not only language and culture that determine these divisions. There is also a growing confrontation between urban and non-urban regions, similarly to other situations around the world. Urban regions are much more affected by multilingualism. In some cities, for instance Zurich or Lausanne or Geneva, up to 50% of population is foreign. In the non-urban regions, the other is further away, less present, and so more worrying. This is reflected in the results of all the referenda on immigration, integration, and diversity. So we can't really talk about a clash of languages, but neither can we say that Switzerland is a paradise of linguistic intercomprehension and intercomprehension at all. Rather than harmonious communion, we should be talking about peaceful neighborliness. The secret of stability in a country so marked by diversity is not the injunction of a national brotherhood, but simply the right to live alongside others without necessarily taking an interest in them. It's not very exciting. It's true. But that's how this country has lived for almost 2 centuries without any major internal conflicts.
Thank you. And Professor Balázs, do you see this clash of languages on border, Hungarian-Romanian border, or this peaceful neighborhood life like in Switzerland?
Well, when I was invited to this round table, I tried to figure out what my role is, and what I have different hats for this discussion. One is the hat of the academic, researching such issues of interculturality, multicultural environment, and so on, but mostly in literature. My other hat is that of the one who writes poetry in his mother tongue, maybe deals with language in a different way, in a creative way. And my third hat is the one when that is connected to my East Central European background. I mean, in these discussions, I believe I am the one who comes from this broader region. So to answer this question, I have to put on this personal East Central European hat and also the academic hat. First of all, I was born in a small town in Romania, where the population of this small town of 30,000 people, it's called Székelyudvarhely, it had a population of 98% Hungarians, so in Romania. I tell you, and the whole amount of Hungarians in Romania is 6%, if you remember. So this means, and I tell you this because, these problems in Romania are raised differently in such regions that I come from, with 98% Hungarians, and in places in Romania where nobody has ever seen one single Hungarian person. Of course, there are many regions in our country, such regions. Currently, I live in a city, Cluj, where about 16% of the population is Hungarian. So it's already a big difference within my life experience living in such a different environment. In Romania, we spoke about laws, for example, which is important when we think about these issues. Romanian laws speak about a proportion of 20%. 20% is a symbolic proportion included into laws. Means if there is a town with more than 20% minority population, then we can use the names in official, the bilingual signs of when you enter the city, for example, the name of these towns. And this 20% is included in many laws in Romania. And of course, many of these are very good laws. The problem is when you try to use those laws, this practical side of laws, it's not working many times in our country, but the laws are okay. I can really agree with many of the laws in Romania are okay from a minority perspective. And to come to my other hat of the academic, very briefly, I teach at our university a course called Intercultural Communication between Modern Romanian, Hungarian, and German literatures of Transylvania. You may know that these three languages had their own literary traditions in Transylvania. And basically, what your question referred to, the relationship between these social groups, what I teach to my students is that every time it's connected to power. I mean, the power is a very important aspect here, because in Transylvania the power was not constantly in the same hands. Sometimes power switched, sometimes Hungarians were in power, now Romanians are in power, the Saxons in southern Transylvania, the German language population, had their own power in local communities. And I believe literature, many of us are literary scholars here, literature reflects very clearly, and we can use literary texts to deal with these conflicts and how the other communities are perceived. Literature is a very important document in this sense, and maybe, like Professor Spivak told us in the morning, maybe the literature offers us a different kind of knowledge, how to get out of our boxes, to think outside our boxes, and it is very important.
I noticed some similarities between Poland and Romania. We also have in Poland regions where people haven't seen even single Hungarian. So, Professor Nicol, how you look to this conflict or not conflict or peaceful life of social groups according to languages and how they affect it?
Yeah, it's interesting. There, and before I answer, I just want to say that I find it fascinating because, in a sense, I think that there's two clusters. There's the concept of power, and then the power of law, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about law and legislation, and then there's the continuum of there's a little bit of law, a little sprinkling of law, but mainly the peaceful, the community model that you're talking about. So the cohabitation and the depth of diversity, and I think that in Canada, it's been an interesting half a century, I'd say, because although I would say that we're moving, towards linguistic diversity, I think that nobody can forget that this has been a really sort of a fraught process. And the main area really does focus around law and enactment of language law and power. And it's the big, sort of one of the big fault lines, if you will, in Canada has been the what's happened to the relationship between French and English language in Quebec. Language is a highly politicized issue, and when it has been politicized in Quebec, it's been tied to the rise of nationalism, a Quebec nationalism. It's been successfully tied to that, in fact, to the point where there is now a federal party in House of Commons in Canada, which really, and has often been the official opposition, which is in effect a French nationalist party, and very strongly tied to understandings of language and positioning of language within the province. And I think that if you think about what the clashy part of all of this, in Canada, until about 1974, there were no real, Quebec was simply subject to language laws of Canada, official bilingualism. So you spoke French, you spoke English, a situation, you're talking about the German, dominance. It really, was a little bit of that, who's dominant, what sector you're in. But after in 1977, Bill 101 was passed. And Bill 101 was effectively a French-only language law, passed by the province, passed not federally. And the first piece that it touched upon was law, that, language in the conduct for law, government, and then for the language of business, and effectively for the language of everyday life, one would be using French. And that language law had teeth. And that language law was put into effect, and it really was contentious. There were political scenarios in Quebec where you might have seen you might have seen a different Canada in some respects, but that controversial law then created a clash because, of course, not everybody in Quebec wants to speak French. And in particular, immigrant populations in Quebec come with a variety of backgrounds and a variety of languages coming to Canada, because Canada tends to settle, immigrant resettlement tends to be in the major centers. That's always the push, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. So when recruiting immigrant populations and contributors to Canadian society, a lot will go to Montreal, thinking, of course, that they will, this is great, we'll learn English, we will be competitive in a North American market, our children will learn English, and of course, that didn't materialize with Bill 101. Immigrants were subject to that law. The only people that had access to English education in Quebec after that law was those who were like second generation English. If your parents spoke English, if you were English speaking mother tongue, your parents spoke English. I believe they might have even had to go to an English, I don't know quite the details, but then you qualified to go to an English speaking school in Quebec. You could learn in English. Otherwise, you learned in French. And that created quite a backlash. In fact, one election was basically, it was felt was lost on the backlash of immigrant reaction to Bill 101. It didn't change. In fact, it's still the case that French is the dominant language, the official language of Quebec. But what has happened is, in response to that, in one sense, Quebec has become more politically confident. It's become less, I think, strident in terms of being a separatist nation, because it was recognized, certainly by Harper, Prime Minister Harper, 2013, I forget the specific date, that Quebec is a nation within a nation, that it has its own right to nationhood, and it has its own language protected, and that language has teeth. But on the other hand, it really creates the issue of a sort of a monocultural Quebec within a multicultural Canada. And that has stuck in a lot of the craw of a lot of Canadians, and not, I would say, it stuck more in the craw of right-wing Canadians. And one of the reasons why a year ago in January, Canada had what they call the Freedom Convoy. I don't know if you've heard of that, but the Freedom Convoy was a group of truckers that started out west, drove across Canada to Ottawa to basically overthrow the government and tell the Prime Minister he was no longer needed and have one of their members appointed. And that obviously didn't materialize. But that is, a sense, the polarization of the other end of the spectrum of Canadians from very monolingual provinces. And not particularly, more rural and they're becoming more diverse. But it's that positioning, perhaps, of a Canada of a plural, multilingual, strong Quebec, a multicultural Canada, and then the reaction to that. A group feeling that is in fact taking away from their heritage and their rights as Canadians, and so there is that tension, and it's not it didn't go away with the fact that referendums Quebec didn't separate from Canada, and likely never will. I think Quebec is pretty well pleased at this point with its position in Canada. It's a powerful province. It's a politically strong province. But there are other tensions that were set in motion through that particular language bill. And I guess just the last thing, just to touch on, I'm not going to go back to the Indigenous language sort of struggles. I think that's more up and coming than they are now. But the other thing where there's a clash of language is place names. And I don't know if that's here when, I presume that this is not, people here are familiar with that concept, when in Canada, the renaming of places is essentially taking back names of places that were named after pretty notorious colonizer types, those who were kind of outrageous. It's happening. I mean, it's happening to university. Ryerson University became Toronto Metropolitan. Names are being changed. Place names are being changed. Indigenous names are now repopulating, particularly across northern Canada. Nunavut, of course, is an indigenous name, and Iqaluit is the old Frobisher Bay, I believe. So, I mean, place names are also another way of contesting and pushing back. And I would say that that's one of the big issues that's happening now.
Thank you very much. We started from politics or political level, social level. Now let's move to individual level and how language is influencing perception of individuals. And to start it, I will give you an example from neighbor country where war is now. In Ukraine by 2022, Russian-speaking media were synonymous with credibility for most of the population of Ukrainians. Now the Russian language was almost eliminated in Ukraine, although in news services in radio and television, which is very interested, the statements originally spoken in Russian are not translated. And do you notice in your countries and in your research that the position of language on the spectrum from glorification to contempt influences the attitude of societies, political choices, and other areas of life from the also individual perspective? Does it determine the perception of the person or social position of individual?
Another third very complex question. I'm
trying my best.
Yeah, since I've already spoken about the status of Finnish in Sweden and the status of Swedish in Finland, I will bring up a third language, which is de facto and de jure minority language in Finland, the Tatar language, which is spoken by a very small, numerically very small community, which has been present in the country since Finland was a Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire, and which has largely, completely by its own powers, its own resources, maintained the Tatar language, kept it alive, and stayed as a part of the Tatar diaspora in the world. So, mentioning them, there is difficulty in Finland to determine how many people actually speak this language, because in Finland you can log in at the website of the Digital and Population Data Services Agency and register your language there. Of course, if you have been born in Finland, it is already registered there. But there's a joke among us who identifies bilinguals or multilinguals that sometimes on Friday night after a few drinks we have fun logging in and changing the language just to mess with them, or just to see what happens next time we deal with the public authorities. Well, I usually get most of my information in Swedish because I did this switch when I was an adult already. Now I contribute numerically to the 5% of Swedish speakers in Finland, despite being born a Finnish speaker. But if you look at the statistics from that website, there are only about 220 speakers of Tatar language in Finland. These numbers are from 2021, so relatively fresh. And it's thought that the number of Tatar speakers is decreasing in the country. However, if you look at the numbers back when this website did not exist and you could not self-identify as a grown-up, for example, or as an immigrant, this number is based on self-reported first language and excludes bi- and multilingual speakers that may choose to report a different language. And in 1991, merely 62 individuals reported Tatar as their first language when these sort of censuses were made on paper. So you would respond to a census and then the authorities would know your language. So the apparent increase in numbers may reflect an increasing willingness to self-report, actually, rather than population growth or something else. So perhaps the younger generation or recent immigrants from the former Soviet Union have been more eager to report their native language than the older generation. And well, it's an open question. Why is it now more okay to tell the authorities that, yes, I speak this language as my native language? And my guess is, unfortunately, this is just an informed guess, I should interview people on a more large scale, that in the past people were reluctant to share this information with the state for various historical reasons, because of the background of a large part of the Tatar population in Finland as refugees from the Soviet Union. So it might have been a way to safeguard the true numbers, for example, to avoid getting deported. We can speculate on the reasons. Basically, that's my example of how an individual can regulate how much the authorities are aware of the languages they are speaking, and also the limits to this, because now there's a debate in Finland that we should actually make the multilingual people, the bilingual people, more visible officially, so that we would see that, yes, we also exist. And well, what would the practical consequences of that be? That's hard to tell, because we have this very strong tradition of one individual, one language, although we are a multilingual country. Thank you.
That's very interesting. Thank you. And Professor Rosset, how do you see it from your perspective, how the language we use or anyone use in Switzerland can influence his perception?
Yes, starting with the media, it was your question. Well, in Switzerland, each linguistic region has its own newspapers, and the national broadcaster has 3 entities for German, French, and Italian, with 2 program channels for each. There is virtually no interpenetration of these entities in their programs. And so you can go your whole life without consuming any media services in a language other than your own. And more generally, I can say that you can go your whole life without relations with other people speaking another language. On the other hand, tabloid type media, or media serving populist socio-political positions, sometimes stir up stereotypes that are clearly linked to one or other linguistic and cultural community. For instance, by highlighting the heaviness or rigidity of the German-speaking population, or describing the Latin-speaking population as not very serious or reliable. But it never goes very far. The problem is a little greater when it comes to relations between German-speaking Swiss and the many Germans from Germany who live in Switzerland. Here, the very marked difference in the use of the language, dialects versus Hochdeutsch, often introduces problems in the perception of the other, awakening cultural inferiority complexes in some, the Swiss, and superiority in others, German people. And it's, I think it's an example of this individual experience. Perhaps another example it's the experience of immigrants. And so we can bring the example of, for instance, a Pole coming in Switzerland, for instance, in St. Gallen. And he knows English, but not German, and not St. Gallerdeutsch. And he has to learn, firstly, St. Gallerdeutsch to have interactions with the neighbors. Also, German, to can understand what is written around. But it's really too much to learn, in addition, French or Italian. And for immigrant people, the genuine indigenous multilingualism in Switzerland is a huge problem.
Yeah, it might be a huge achievement, yeah. Thank you very much. And Professor Balázs, how do you see this individual, the perception of individuals?
Yeah, I believe at this point it is relevant to think about artists who use language as their material for their art. And of course in Romania we are many there are many of us who are multilingual in an everyday sense. We use several languages on the street, family, during the education process. But there are very few authors who write actually poetry or fiction in two languages. And when I tried to study such examples who are bilingual as authors, as writers, then I noticed that there is a new tendency in Romania also. Of course, globally we can see that there are emerging more and more authors who tend to be multilingual. And there is a new trend in Romania to have authors who write also in Hungarian and also in Romanian, let's say books of poetry or fiction. And when I tried to think of it, why this wasn't the case, for example, 20 years ago or for a whole century, then I realized my answer to that would be that the global situation somehow changes this attitude towards multilingualism. And like the Finnish example told us that it would be interesting to see bilingual people as a separate category. I believe it's an emerging problem and an emerging experience throughout the world, and I can confirm this in the Romanian-Hungarian case because in the Romanian context you had to choose. You would have been either Romanian writing in Romanian or Hungarian writing Romanian. It was connected to the nation-building processes of Romanians and Hungarians. It was connected to the conflicts between our peoples. And I believe that the changing of the world around us somehow is connected to this newly emerging thing. If I go back in time, of course, research on multilingualism and connected to everyday multilingualism showed in Romania that the prestige, one language always has a higher level of prestige among these languages, and in Romania. nowadays, because of its official and legislation, it's the highest level is the Romanian language. But it is very important to see if you can use Hungarian or any other minority language as a language of culture. If you can have education from elementary school to university or PhD, it is our case. In the Hungarian language has this possibility that it can be the language of culture, the language of education in Romania, and this is important. But there were periods, like your example again, with Finnish and Swedish people, that when they heard you on the street speaking another language and they told you, why do you speak this language? You eat Romanian bread. This is crazy. Maybe it's a traveling motive, cultural motive. This bread connected to nationality. Bread has nationality. This situation was, and maybe we could discuss also historical things here. That this relationship between languages changes historically, and the worst situation for Hungarian in Romania, I believe, was in the late communist regime of Nicolae Ceausescu before 1989. When I grew up, I spent 14 years of my life under this late communist regime, which was also quite nationalist, which is unusual for some of our East Central European countries. So that was really the period when Hungarian and minority languages were restricted to family language, tended to be restricted to family language, and no cultural language, no educational language. After 89, it was a lucky turn for us, and yeah, I believe the direction is all right in this sense.
Thank you very much. Canada has another experience because these languages are public, from not minorities, and how do you see this influence of social chances or the perception of individual to how language is influencing these possibilities?
Yeah, it's interesting, and Imre, when you were talking, I was just made myself a note that I think there's at least three things, possibly four ways in which these are related. One is certainly perception of self, and when you were speaking, it just occurred to me what I hadn't even thought to mention was that the perception of self is so linguistically defined in Canada that we, unlike Americans, perhaps not unlike Europeans, but unlike Americans, we have what we call the hyphenated Canadian. And I was just joking the other day in class, I was spelling Canadian with a hyphen and an H after the C, because Canadians do see themselves as Italian Canadian, whatever Canadian you want to be, Ukrainian Canadian, Russian Canadian, and that's been a long tradition. And of course that sense of identity, it's nationality, but it's also language, as you can see, because we have we're French Canadian, who are born in Canada and therefore are Canadian, but have also are hyphenated Canadians. So I think that sense of that sense of perception digs really deep into who people think they are and how they relate to their language, and how that language in turn positions themselves in this whatever you want to call it in Canada. That's I won't say mosaic, but this the islands of identity and language in Canada. And yes, most people are English speaking Canadians still, although maybe not Anglo in the traditional sense. And of course, that's affected everything in Canada, because people will tell you the perception of what Canada is an Anglo perception. If you're talking about Canadian studies, where I come from, the perception of what Canadian studies is a Canadian, an Anglo perception. It's a central Canada, Ontario, English-speaking sort of definition of norms that shapes that Canadian identity that, and again, a lot of people don't buy into, and that's part of the sort of the tension, and it's part of this perception of what Canada is being based on a linguistic sort of moniker, and of course that translates into political perspectives. And we've been talking a little bit about regions, in some cases regional concentrations of language, and that's very true in Canada as well. And again, I'm just going to position it as a little bit unique from the US. Maybe just differentiate, because people may not differentiate Canada and the US so much. In Canada, we do have very specific regions, and of course, you understand the French-speaking Quebec. But, there's a dialect of English spoken in Newfoundland that you'd be hard-pressed. Certainly, it's changing a bit now with, sort of mass media, but you would have been hard-pressed to understand a while ago. There are, of course, the Indigenous languages. There's English, and then if you move into Western Canada historically, not so much today, but you would have found probably Ukrainian and Icelandic and those languages spoken. But that regionalism in some places has gotten really recalcitrant, and so that you have again, unlike the United States, you have political parties that are linguistically based. The Bloc Québécois and the various iterations of French parties that have developed around language. And I think that's really important to recognize too, that there is this political basis to language that plays out in plays out certainly in the ballot box, and that is an extension of perception and identity. The other thing that's really interesting, in fact, I called a friend last night, because you're allowed to do this sometimes, and said, look, help, perception, language, what can you tell me? And they gave me a fabulous example of how language itself is structurally. So we've talked about identity, power, but then there's a structural way of organizing how you think. And certainly there are differences in French, English, and maybe we'll save that for the next, this is relevant to maybe what we're going to talk about next. But my colleague said, think about mischief, and mischief is a Métis language. And I said, if you understand that language as a hybrid of French, English, and Cree. And what's really fascinating about that language, and I think speaks to the issue of perception and language, is that all the verbs come from Cree and all the nouns come from French language. So the doing stuff is organized around thinking as an Indigenous person. And as my friend said, the static stuff, all the nouns and the things are related to French and also English, use of English words. The questions, when you ask a question in mischief, that comes from the Cree language. You're not questioning from a different language. And I thought that was a really interesting sort of example of really how it's also structural, how we think and how we express ourselves really come from the ability of our language to, thanks. The ability of our language to be able to put into words those thoughts. And if the words aren't there, you really can't say the thoughts. And I just leave you with one other example, and I'm going to stop, is there's a word, Gaswenta, and I don't know if that's Anishinaabe or Haudenosaunee. I really am not that much of a Indigenous scholar, but my colleague who is tells me that Gaswenta, does anybody know what that means? Anybody heard of it? So you won't know if I'm wrong. Okay, so Gaswenta is basically the two-row wampum. It's the relationship around the two-row wampum. We don't have any word to describe that. The two-row wampum isn't just a two-row wampum, it's a beading of two rows of blue and then the white spaces in between. And Gaswenta means the spaces in between the two, as I understand it, the spaces in between the two wampum, which speaks to the relationship between different peoples and different cultural systems and the ability to interact and build a relationship and to live well together. So we don't have that word, and I think it's too bad we don't.
Thank you very much. We've got last 6-7 minutes because we started a few minutes later. So as a graduate of School of Journalism of this university, I have to ask a last question about media. And we talked politics, social groups, individuals. Now I want to ask you last question about the domination of languages, especially in multilinguistic societies, and how language can limit multiculturalism by the domination of language used in media. And I would like to ask you for a short answers, because maybe we'll have a chance for 1 or 2 questions from public after it. Thank you.
It feels almost easier at this point to ask with counter questions and maybe ask them to the public, like because I have already questioned some of the terms here, which have their own history or can be interpreted in various ways. Like, what do we mean by multilingualism or multilingual media, or do we talk about a system of parallel monolingual media? Like, I assume in Switzerland, for example, you can consume media in one single language throughout your whole life, and that could also be applied to Finland and naturally Sweden also, as an example, where it's easy for the majority language speakers to just avoid the minority languages. And then could also ask that, do we mean a system where people actually consume media multilingually, where it's possible that that media is not just limited to one linguistic group as a target audience, but and then I'm thinking back into the past. In Finland, in the beginning of the 20th century, it was quite common that at least the educated audience consumed media in both Finnish and Swedish, and they were able to compare what was being written in the different party political newspapers, because of course it was a divided media landscape anyway, but there was a dialogue over the linguistic borders, plus that the educated audience in Finland could follow what was written in Sweden about Finland and comment on that, often very critically. And then there was a dialogue over the sea, which is also something that is perhaps still in some ways existing, but not to that extent as in the past. So sometimes I can get a bit nostalgic, despite the fact that this dialogue in the past could be very aggressive and hostile, and maybe we don't want that part back, but it would be nice to see more of a dialogue involving many languages, also transnationally. And this is what many linguistic minorities, of course, do, because they communicate transnationally with their fellow language speakers in other countries. But perhaps majorities could take a cue from that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Rosset, you already touched the topic of the isolation.
I already said
yes.
the most important, but I just will add the example of the most well-known newspaper in Switzerland, that is Neue Zürcher Zeitung. The Neue Zürcher Zeitung is one of the leading newspapers in the whole of the German-speaking world, and even more widely in Europe. And it has no particular position on the issue of multilingualism in Switzerland. But educated people in the French part or in the Italian part read the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, not as a German-Swiss newspaper, but just as a good paper.
That's a good point. Thank you. Thank you. Professor Balázs?
Yeah, I believe I should give an example about, I talked about everyday multiculturalism and everyday multilingualism. And of course, when we think in the case of Romania, who are these people who do have the multilingualism? These people tend to be minority people knowing their mother tongue and the state language, Romanian. But there was a very interesting exception from that rule, which is historical, but I believe it could be interesting in this case. Romanian people living alongside the Hungarian border during the 1980s, which was the characteristic of those people. They were able to receive Hungarian television broadcasting. And during the late 1980s, Romanian state television had, let's say, 2 hours and a half of broadcast with Nicolae Ceausescu appearing and talking about the inevitable access to communism and solving all our problems and the decadent West and so on. But Hungarian television, at that time, Hungary developed in the other direction to the Gorbachev type of state socialism, which became more and more open. And of course, it had more broadcasts with Western movies and so on. This whole lifestyle issue was present during these TV broadcasts. So it was important for Romanians living in those cities to understand Hungarian, and many of them really learned. So my example, I believe, speaks about how can you motivate the majority to, what is the motivation for them to become bilingual in this sense, and this is a quite rare example, I believe, but there are some examples like this.
Thank you. It were good times for Hungarian media, and we keep our fingers crossed for today Hungarian media to do the same and to give the message of freedom to Romania. We hope this day will come. And how do you think in Canada the domination of media language can limit multiculturalism?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and of course there's one big problem that we face perhaps more than here, which is the dominance, the almost total dominance of American media and news. There is a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It does broadcast in English and French and 8 Indigenous languages. For a long time, the second largest newspaper in Canada was in the Chinese language, Mandarin, I believe, on the West Coast. Since COVID, I know that situation has changed. The end of certainly a lot of the major print newspapers in Chinese, and of course, what's happening there is, and I think it's a sort of a story about the importance of multilingualism in media, is that a lot of older Canadians who may be immigrants and who may in fact be do not speak either of the 2 official languages, and there's about 4 million Canadians that don't, relied on things like the Chinese print newspapers to really stay connected with the world. And so that the decline of sort of a multilingual print newspapers, the decline of print newspapers, but in particular those in non-English or French language, I think has been pretty marginalizing for a lot of Canadians and communities. And of course, it's the small newspapers and the small media. Generally speaking, minority languages are small media newspapers, and so it's even more of a struggle than the big ones. The other thing I just want to say, well, I'll circle back to the American one to finish, but the Canadian and English and French newspapers in Quebec, as many of you may know, don't report the same news the same way. And so it's quite still a bit of a divide in perception and the way that news is presented and filtered. And so, again, if you're reliant on one language to provide the totality of your news, you're probably going to have kind of a limitation. But don't worry, we have the American news, and that's that's in fact what's moving in. Is we are more and more and more Canadian content, and we try to protect. We have rules to protect it, but again, not wanting to be an isolationist kind of country. We are dominated by American media, and that does create problems too. First of all, it overwhelms again the English. It just piles on to the English side because all the American media is in English. We don't get certainly any of the Hispanic programming that you might find elsewhere in the States. We don't get it. It piles onto that, and then it also creates issues so that I'm going to finish with it's not a joke, but it's a funny story. The Freedom Convoy that I mentioned earlier that drove from prairies to Ottawa to take over the House, the Canadian government. And of course, to their surprise, all the ringleaders got arrested. And in front of the judge, and this is true, in front of the judge, one of the main it's 6:40, one of the main ringleaders turned to the judge and said, "I won't answer that. I'm going to plead the Fifth Amendment." And the judge just looked at him and said, "What country?" He said, "What, you're going to do what?" And he said, "The Fifth Amendment." And he just said, "You do know we don't have a Fifth Amendment." And he was the guy was flabbergasted because we've watched Law and Order. We've watched all these shows. We listen to the Trump news all the time. We know you should be able to do this, right? So that's you can tie that in with perception, but it is a piling on and a shift that makes the minority news much weaker and much more vulnerable.
Thank you very much. I received a signal that we don't have time for additional questions because we run out of time. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say a big thank to our distinguished guests. Please give them applause. Ainur Elmgren, Heather Nicol, Imre József Balázs, and François Rosset. Thank you very much. Please support scientists, support professional journalists. Thank you very much for your time together. We are at the starting holiday season, so happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas. We've got representative Santa Claus, and we've got a Santa Claus Day today, so well done, and have a good evening, and see you soon. Thank you.